All right, let's get this going. Good morning, well, afternoon, depending on where you are in this world. My name is Brad Feeks, and I'm with the EstesGroup. And I'm here today with my colleague and cohort, Chris Koppler, and we want to do a little bit of talking today about private SaaS versus private cloud ERP systems. We've had a lot of questions lately from our customer base regarding how private cloud and public cloud, how SaaS versus hosting interact with each other and how they differ. And I wanted to have this time here set aside so that Chris and I could have some conversations with you and just kind of talk through some of these differences and similarities between SaaS and private cloud hosting, and kind of talk through them and help guide, hopefully, customers in understanding what the best decisions to make in this field are. So, truth is, kind of the reason we're doing this is the cloud's this really ambiguous term and it gets used all over the place, right? And what we end up finding is that there truly are many different shades of cloud. And when I talk with customers, we find that discussing these different forms of application deployment, things get, not surprisingly, kind of cloudy. And I had this one customer who, after a long and painful implementation, came to us and said that my biggest regret in implementing this specific ERP system was the vendor's SaaS solution. Using that solution, it created more problems than it actually solved. So when all things were said and done, the biggest limitation to the implementation itself ended up being the platform on which it was based. Now, quite often, the platform is one of the last things that gets discussed when we're talking about an implementation of an ERP system. Companies are concerned with functionality and capability and what the system can do without understanding that those things are all really strongly influenced by that underlying platform that the system is actually resting upon. And in this case, the implementation of a SaaS system was a huge limiter to what the customer needs to do. Now, you might be asking yourself, why is that such a limiting factor? The cloud's everywhere. Lots of customers are implementing various cloud-based systems and successful with it. What makes a SaaS or public cloud-based application difficult for one customer and not for another? And that's kind of what we want to get through today and talk to in a little more detail. So it starts with service models. Now, you've probably been inundated as a customer with all the different potential service models that exist. This as a service, that as a service. Almost everything these days gets marketed to you as a service. I think quite often that is just what it is, marketing. I would say the simplest way of understanding service models is the idea that you're treating a thing that used to be treated as a product and you're converting it into a service. So something like computing power, you buy a server, you buy this physical, tangible thing, or software, you buy an installed disk, right? Those things have been converted into services, non-tangible items now that used to be or formerly were tangible. So this affects the idea of ownership. When you're consuming a service, you're not buying a server anymore. You're not buying that application's install file. You're more licensing those resources, those software capabilities, and you're doing that on a subscription basis, right? You're not buying something that's a one-time perpetual ownership. It's something that you license and own only so long as you keep paying. And this understandably would affect some budgetary considerations. We talk about long-term capital expenditures versus short-term operating expenses. That is something we'll go into here shortly. But it really also affects what you call access and control. When something is presented as a service, you are no longer the provider. You're more the client as a customer, and you're consuming that service. Now, you compare that to an old school on-premise installation where you're an application administrator. You are setting up the server, setting up the application, helping to configure it, and then deploy it to the user community. You're serving as a provider to your internal customers. Now, in service models, that script gets flipped a bit. Now you're more strictly consuming this product as a client, and all that back end magic that's going on behind the scenes. You no longer have visibility to that. So this is an access and control issue. You don't have those things anymore. We'll talk more about how those become an important consideration. All right. So some of those considerations we want to talk about right away when we're talking about the cloud. We want to talk about functionality and capability because those are affected potentially by your deployment model. We want to talk about access. So access means your ability to get into the system's back-end instantiation. Control, the ability to control that instantiation, to be able to manage that environment, the ability to integrate that environment with other third-party applications, right? We talk about the term hybrid cloud. It's a real another nice nebulous term that marketers make a heyday with. The idea of an integrated set of applications becomes a hybrid cloud because potentially you could have different applications that are sitting on different platforms having to speak to each other. So you come up with a hybrid model and not a pure single thing. Cost, of course, needs to be a consideration because all these decisions you make have costs. Some of them are long-term capital costs, some of them are short-term, some of them are hidden costs. They get buried and bundled up together, but they're certainly important, both in terms of their long-term and short-term implications. Another would be performance, right? What you have in a public versus private cloud environment, your ability to apportion resources and have them dedicated to you versus shared resources, there's some definite considerations you want to have there. And that is because the idea of application deployment, it's a continuum and it does get cloudy. And I like to think about the idea of an on-premise install on one side and a software as a service as the other. And that continuum is a continuum of access, control, functionality, and what I like to call responsibility. Responsibility is kind of a big term that can mean a lot of things. It could mean ownership, management, risk. But as you get to an on-prem environment, you have full control, right? You own that environment, you have total access to it. You can control and administer the environment, whether it's the database server, the application server, the terminal servers that are consuming that. You also have the responsibility to keep that environment up and running. That means the data center that you're using internally, what a recent customer called their little hidden closet, right? That little hidden closet is a responsibility of yours to make sure that it's being cooled, that you have redundant power, that you have adequate connections to your users so that you avoid downtime. I had a customer in the South where it was very humid, and every time that it got a certain amount of heat plus humidity, the system went down, right? So they eventually had to find a way to get themselves into the cloud just because their on-premise environment couldn't keep up with the climate that they were living in, this sort of subtropical climate. Now, as you go further over the continuum, you go from on-premise to co-location. Right now, you've taken some less responsibility now that those data center architecture responsibilities have been consumed by the data center provider, but you still have, some of the access and control and still responsible for keeping that server running. You get into a version of cloud where now you're into infrastructure as a service or now platform as a service. Again, access and control is still there, maybe in some degrees different than in a pure on-prem, kind of depends on what you're after as an organization. But some of those responsibilities now have been assumed by the cloud provider. And then you get to the SaaS model. Now you have the least amount of responsibility to keep the system running, but some of those other things that you have in terms of access and control have disappeared, and your functionality may even be affected by this. So I like to think of that as a continuum. And so let's dig into a couple of these models a little bit more detail, and let's look at software as a service and get an idea of some of the key pieces to it. So one big piece is it's subscription based, right? So your application license and also the other related components of deployment and maintenance, vendors tend to bundle up that into a single cost, and there's no real permanent ownership as we've described. And so because of that, all those elements, license, deployment, support, are all treated as operational expenses or OpEx. We'll get down to that in another slide here. The idea of a software as a service, I got a peace symbol here, right? The idea of a public cloud is kind of one big hippie commune in the sky, right? Where everybody's kind of sharing this resource. Here you have communal resources, and you had better hope that your bro on your side, your sis on your left aren't consuming too many resources, because it's shared, so there's limits across that shared environment. You also have limits because of that to the application's backend. If everybody's sharing the same server, no individual can go in there and poke around, because the things they're doing will affect everyone else. All right. So one piece that's of course good is that you don't own hardware in an environment like that. You don't have the need to own hardware if you don't want to own the hardware. It's a good situation to be in, because all of that's pushed off to the provider. And if you're in the absence of IT need, IT support, you don't have those, abilities. All those things are limited. The only thing you're really required to do from an IT standpoint is make sure your users can connect to the system. It's all client side requirements, nothing on the server. Now, you don't also have you don't have that access to the back end, right? So if you have minimal integration needs, that's not a problem. But many of those integration capabilities that systems have might not be supported in a SaaS environment if, say, you have a third-party application that needs to connect at the database level in an ODBC situation. And I've seen a lot of that lately, where specific applications are database driven. I had one where the integrations truly were at the database level, not just read only. We had, I saw one customer, they had an AR integration that had SQL stored procedures sitting in there. It had SQL jobs. These were running on a schedule. So there's this huge database layer of integration going on. Now, in a software as a service model, that's impossible, because that database is being shared across many different customers. So you don't want one individual customer to come stick in their stored procs and their jobs and have that affect other customers. So you see the implications to a SaaS model if you have some legacy applications that still are not communicating over like a REST API or what have you. I like to talk about functionality a lot when I'm talking about SaaS. Because you get to this idea of configuration versus customization. Now, I was sitting in a sales meeting once of an ERP vendor, and the CEO was talking about, he was seeing his application is divided roughly down the middle between two parties. One, the SaaS customers who could just use system configuration, and then the on-prem and cloud-hosted customers who needed much more robust features. They needed to be able to customize that application, the ability to insert custom business logic, additional reporting tools, more complex integrations. And that's that whole idea of, if your business requirements are very simple, okay, configuration may be adequate for you. As you get more and more complex, the abilities of a SaaS model become a little more challenging. So SaaS can generally support configuration, but not customization. And then there's the question of migration. So if you're migrating, we often see challenges for existing ERP customers. New ERP customers kind of marry into that a little easier. We'll talk a little bit more about that downstream here. So on the other side of the continuum, there's the idea of a private cloud version. So when we were looking down, we had SaaS on one side, and shortly to the left of it, you had some of the private cloud options, infrastructure and platform as a service. I'm going to treat those as one, because really there's a certain level of, even between those, gradations in terms of the services and functionality that a customer wants to consume versus the features and functionalities that a provider will assume. One thing that's common to them all, it's a perpetual license model. So unlike SaaS here, you buy that license and you own it. All right, and that is separate from the deployment of the application and the support of the application. You have a private cloud that is customer specific. Okay, so in this case, the idea of privacy is you are working in your own box and you're not affected by other members of that community like you would be in a public environment. And really, it's a lot. In many ways, it's like having an on-premise environment in the cloud. So if you had the things that you normally had as an on-premise customer, access, control, integration, et cetera, those pieces are very similar. And often we actually do what we call a lift and shift, where we take an image of a customer's on-premise environment and we move that image into the cloud, into a VM in the cloud, and you're literally able to port it over. The similarities are that strong. Of course, you need some configuration tweaks and such because of IP address changes and such, but the general principle allows for a great deal of portability. And we talk about it in terms of the application management and the varying degrees that are allowed within this model here, because different customers have different needs. Some have a really skilled database administrator, so the database administration falls to the customer, but they don't have a good network admin. So the next layer of administration is consumed by the provider. Other cases, we have customers who want pretty much everything taken care of by the provider. So that's more of a platform as a service where the entire application platform is just presented to the customer. So we talk about stand up versus maintenance, right? So the provider may just stand up the application and then basically turn the keys over to the customer to maintain that environment. That's not uncommon, especially in some of the industries and ERPs we have, where we meet customers who are really capable and really solid in terms of their knowledge of the system and its back end, and they want to take that environment and run it. They want to configure all their third-party applications. They don't need assistance with that. Now, there might be the case there that the customer even wants to stand up those third-party applications and they don't need assistance from us. Other times, they might have the cloud provider, like the EstesGroup, to come in and help them navigate that complex situation. I have some customers where they'll come to us and they've actually inherited this application. So they know that there's a lot out there, but they don't know what's the core application versus the hybrid cloud of third parties integrated to it. And they can't make that clear line of delineation. They need someone to come in and do a discovery and help them understand that delineation. They feel like they have kind of a ticking time bomb because they don't know just what's all under the hood. So they bring someone like us in. We come in, we open up the hood, and we find all the pieces and how they need to be put back together. And I think one piece here is really important is those relationships are not always the same over time. We get situations where we'll take an infrastructure as a service customer and someone will retire and they don't have an easy replacement. I'm sure if you see right now, the ability to hire people has been challenged across industries. So there are many cases where they need to rely now on their provider to fill in certain areas that weren't originally part of the original agreement. And that's that kind of backstop capability when you're working in a private cloud, is the provider has that ability to step in and manage that ecosystem as things change. So really, we talk about infrastructure versus platform. Platform is more of a managed hosting. Sometimes you hear that term there because there's that extra managed layer. Sometimes infrastructure is called unmanaged hosting. I don't really like that term because it sounds a little too cowboy for me. But I think from a costing model, you really want to understand the differences, because the licensing now in this model, the licensing is still a CapEx acquisition, while the deployment and the support are still OpEx. So that's kind of one key there in differentiating between SaaS and a private cloud, is that the licensing, because you're doing a perpetual license, you're still dealing in a CapEx model. But there really is, in my mind, a real brick wall in the cloud that delineates software as a service from pretty much everything else. And that's this concern of access, integrations, control. Because if you're in a software as a service model, and I've talked about this a little bit, but I really want to try to spell this out. When a vendor creates a software and they create an access layer, normally something like REST or maybe SOAP, where you have interchanges of data over the wires. They basically create a system such that communication can occur over that layer, but at no lower layer below that. Now, when you get into a situation where if you're migrating a whole environment, you need to figure out how each of those applications is going to communicate with the system. And if those applications were communicating at a lower level, you run into the brick wall. I had one customer, they were jumping into a SaaS-based ERP system. They were retrofitting their existing ERP footprint into it. The sales folks had told them, 2 days, or 2 days, 2 months, 2 months to get from their existing on-premise into a SaaS environment. It ended up being 9 months. All right, they had to make a baby. It took that long. You had so many different integrations that had to be tweaked, refunctioned. Some had to be re-implemented, upgraded, all so that they could figure out how to communicate with the system. Some cases they even had to replicate off to a separate database that they could access in a read-only mode. So you had a whole kind of Frankenstein's monster to try to get this system migrated into a SaaS environment. What I find customers like about the private cloud is this ability that comes out of the ability to get down to those lower levels. If you have access that you need at a database level, if there are integrations that are functioning at that level, you can have that. If you have app server level integrations where they are running because of like their Windows scheduled tasks or Windows services, you have that ability at the app server level for those things to be running and integrating without the need to be working at that top level, that top API level. Not that you can't, and there's lots of reasons you would want to work at strictly an API level. There's lots good that comes from like a REST API model where everything has a real clean handshake. The truth is that the entire industry isn't there yet. There's just a lot of pieces to the puzzle that haven't made that migration yet. So I think about an application as like an octopus, right, with a bunch of tentacles, and the head is trying to move in this one direction, and some of those tentacles are really dragging behind. And the challenge always with a cloud migration is that how to get all those tentacles working with the head still without them getting lopped off by that change. And so we've talked about, the flavors of cloud that I sometimes talk about. You have private cloud and you have public cloud. So private cloud would be infrastructure as a service, platform as a service. Public cloud is software, but even within public cloud, you want to talk about there's kind of two flavors that aren't always well marketed or well communicated, and that's applications that are, I call native SaaS. These are things like Salesforce.com or NetSuite. These are applications that were built from the ground up to be SaaS-based applications. All right, they never had any kind of history as an on-premise application. When they were originally architected, they were architected to be a software as a service. Whereas you have what I call retrofit. These are traditional on-premise applications that were retrofitted over time to try and emulate the idea of a software as a service model. The reason that I make this distinction, I think it's really key that a lot of customers buy a SaaS model believing that they're getting the full features of an on-premise model, but in truth, what they get is something that's in process, because vendors, there's been a huge rush from the vendor community to get their systems into a SaaS-based model. But whenever you rush something, there's obviously something that's trailing behind. And that's where some of the things that we've talked about in terms of access and control, but just features and functionality. There are certain features and functionality of a system, server-side business logic, user-defined fields, database access and querying, functional reporting. All right, there's a lot of those kinds of things that were architected originally to be server-based, and vendors are struggling to figure out how to twist those things into a SaaS model when the original architecture just wasn't there to support that. So I really want to specify, when you're running into a system, you're in a software selection cycle, understand whether or not that SaaS-based system that you're considering, is it a retrofit or is it a native SaaS application? And let's talk about cost considerations here a bit. All right, so we've talked about the idea of CapEx and OpEx. All right, that's a term that gets thrown around a lot. It's kind of like one of those finance 101 terms, and I have to restudy every time I go back. So we talk about CapEx. This is kind of your traditional capital-based, asset-based expenditure model, where you have an expenditure that you incur, and it's when you're acquiring a new asset. So a server might be treated as a new asset. A software might be treated as a new asset, and they're tax deductible. But as the asset gets depreciated or amortized over time, the tax deductions come over that extension. All right. Now, when you consider an OpEx model, it's more for expenses that are immediate use, things that you incur in order to manage the daily business, right? And these are tax deductible in the period that the expenses actually occurred. So that's helpful. The bean counters always like this idea of operational expenditures for two reasons. One, they like that taxability. They like to be able to deduct those taxes right when that expense occurs without having to mess with depreciation and amortization. But also, if you're in a cash flow situation, OpEx really allows you to trim back your expenses such that you're taking those big expenses in smaller chunks. So when the expense of buying a server can be an expensive activity for a customer. So they may want to try and treat that as an operating expense through some cloud model and try and kind of, what do they say, eat the elephant in small bites. And I say that's kind of a big piece when you're thinking about the costing models that come along with an ERP system. And that's because now we talk about kind of the core components of an ERP system in terms of cost. And we talked about licensing, right? So your license could be subscription or perpetual. Support. Now, this is the nice piece. This is kind of the hidden cost of ERP that we sometimes forget about, but is really important. Support is the ability to get help when something in the application is wrong, if you run into a bug or something crashes. Also, to keep it upgraded, you need to be paying the support license. So support is this kind of hidden subscription that the vendors give you. And then once you realize it soon enough, it's not hidden anymore. Normally, I've seen it to be somewhere in the field of 20% of licensing, at least in the old on-prem model. And it is subscribable. So it is something that you can treat as an operational expense. A third component would be the deployment. This would be the standing up of the application that we've talked about. And then the implementation itself, that's something that is your application config, process design. Those are costs that are incurred kind of at the time that you're implementing the software itself. And you take those four things, that gives you kind of your total cost of ownership of this application over time. And I kind of have a little bit of a diagram here with this idea of licensing, right? So when you're in a cost model, you want to go to a perpetual license, right? You're going to treat that as a CapEx. You're going to buy it once, you're going to own it forever, unless you subscribe to SAP, but that's a different conversation. Now, if you have a subscription-based license, it's treated as an operational expense because you only own that thing as long as you keep paying for it, all right? And one interesting piece of how software vendors, we've talked about how software vendors like to push SaaS because subscription services are great for company valuation. And if you see, ERP vendors seem to forever be selling themselves off to someone, right? And the best way to do that is to have a high value based on a lot of subscription services, because that's treated as monthly recurring revenue, and that's kind of guaranteed revenue, which drives company valuation. Now, what you might find then is customers or vendors might look to bundle that licensing, that support, and that deployment into a single fee. So you get this OpEx bundle that comes out of it. Operational expenses, lots of good things about that. One little hidden piece there is you think of it sometimes as a monthly subscription. You think of subscriptions happen on a monthly basis. A lot of vendors actually don't do that, and they'll try to push you into a yearly pay so that they can get you basically to commit for that year, pay up front, and then you can use the service. So it's a slightly kind of hybrid version of a subscription model. And it's not uncommon that a vendor won't tell you what that fee is for, because if you have license costs, support costs, and deployment costs all bundled together, just what are you paying for at any given moment? And as costs go up, what portion of that is going up? That's always a challenge that I see a lot of customers have. So when we talk about, key considerations, and Chris, if you're around, why don't you hop in here? Because I want to talk through some of these with you, because I know you run into these with the customer base a lot.
Sure.
This can be something that's a real challenge for a lot of our customers. Now, staffing, what do you see sometimes when customers come to us looking for hosting solutions because of staff-related solutions? What have you seen most common there?
So it usually comes into two fronts. Staffing plays a huge consideration when actually doing the migration to a cloud solution, whether it's SaaS or private cloud. A good chunk of it is chewing through testing, documentation from the customer's perspective, where if they aren't staffed properly, that can extend out that total time frame for implementation in that migration to the cloud event. So that's one of the key pieces. The other key piece that comes down to whether it's SaaS or a private hosted solution is, what does your internal staff look like? You mentioned earlier, do you want to have kind of the environment taken off your hands from a management standpoint? In SaaS, you have limited access and you have that taken off your plate. In a private cloud solution such as ours, you can configure it to where you have that taken off your plate, but you still have full access to your data for integrations, applications. So it just depends on how your upfront environment's really configured. If you're kind of out of the box ERP, SaaS is more viable. If you have customizations or you've been on that ERP platform for quite some time, usually private cloud seems to be the better solution for most of the users that I run into.
Right. Right. And we get to the idea of existing footprint. Now, you and I were in a conversation just recently with a customer who had a pretty substantial existing footprint. They were kicking the tires on SaaS. What do you see customers experience once they've actually tried to bite off SaaS and implement an existing footprint into a SaaS environment?
So the biggest headaches that I hear from most customers, because they are moving to that SaaS model and they lose access to their information, is they don't have control over the third-party integrations, and that seems to be a huge hurdle in the SaaS implementation. It's either that, or if they do make it to where they are actually in a production model on the SaaS platform, a lot of complaints that I hear is performance, because you're basically moving from an on-prem dedicated environment, you could look at it as, to a kind of shared tenant space, to where multiple companies are kind of leveraging those same resources, and that's why they remove access to kind of that layer that you had access to before.
Yeah, I've seen that as well, where customers are running into situations where they've done certain things that were allowable in an on-premise, and then when they move into a SaaS environment, now they suddenly don't work. Even these are native things, SSRS reports or user-defined fields or server-side business logic, things that suddenly now need to be kind of twisted and shaped around to actually be conducive to that SaaS environment.
Correct.
And then access and control. What do you find the user community talk about when it comes to access and control and their environments that you potentially would give them in an on-prem versus a SaaS environment?
And the main hurdle is, it just comes back to that access, not having access to the SQL layer, because a lot of companies that we work with have multiple database integrations. They really need that level of access, and it can sometimes be configured in the SaaS model, but generally that seems to be the primary hurdle if customers are struggling in that SaaS implementation, is around SQL. So that's a pretty big pain point that it just depends on the company. I've seen some be successful, and then I've seen others that have started the implementation, spent about 9 months in that process, and then pulled out at the last second.
Right. That's good points. And then when you talk about, I think this probably is a piece here to note that I don't think that I would say that, well, in terms of an ERP application, I've had some big reservations over the years with SaaS, probably just because I'm coming from the customer base and I jumped from an on-premise install into a SaaS environment and found great challenges in that. With a lot of our third-party partners, they're already SaaS-based. And I think I look at this idea of the hub and spoke, where the hub of the wheel is the most important thing. Everything kind of revolves around that hub. And if you have a hub that is really flexible and really robust, you can do a lot of things. And those spokes, which would quite often be those third-party applications like a CRM system, quality management system, a supplier relationship management, or business intelligence, those quite often have that SaaS model. And it doesn't seem to be a problem because they can speak back to that core ERP system. And what I found with our hosting applications, you have that limitation, or lack of limitation, because a hosted application can speak at that API level with a SaaS application without issue, but it can also speak to those older applications that are functioning at that database layer.
Yeah, I mean, so with third-party integrations, that's the number one headache that I see of problems with SaaS versus on-prem or private cloud. Private cloud or SaaS plays very nice with third-party integrations. SaaS depends on, if it's an application that's pretty common, those don't seem to have as many issues. It depends on how deep you get into that hub and spoke layer. If you have many layers of around that wheel, around your ERP application, that's where you're going to have your biggest hurdle in that reference. The other issue is because now you don't have access to your data, if your third-party integration changes anything on their front from an access standpoint, so the application third-party integration needs access into SQL, and say they update that or something gets changed, the end customer doesn't have the ability to go make that. And so you can see third-party integrations actually get broken in the SaaS model, and you're reliant on them going in and making those updates, which sometimes cannot always be the fastest turnaround.
I've seen that upgrades seem to be the biggest challenge for some of those models when you have a brittle integration that's happening at an unconventional level, that those upgrades, and the hard part, of course, if the frequency of those upgrades make that a real challenge. I've seen a lot of customers who 6 months is too much and too often for upgrading. They want to upgrade every 2 years, right? They want to stay close enough to or whatever ERP system. They want to stay close enough to that ERP system's support window, but they don't want to be doing it at routine, because it consumes so much of the inner company, and to fix all those integrations over and over with every upgrade becomes a real challenge for a lot of folks.
Yep. No, that's one of the pain points I hear often too, is it sounds like that's all they end up doing is they just end up planning for the upgrade because you're forced to go to the latest release, and then they test everything. As soon as that comes out, they're getting the next forced release kind of put on their calendar to start retesting and making sure that nothing breaks, and it's a terrible cycle to get into.
Right. So when I see a customer, I try to give customers kind of an honest opinion of where they're at and what they're doing, and whether or not a given idea would be to go in one direction or another. So if I have a customer and they're a good candidate for a SaaS application, when's a good time to get SaaSy? And I see that if you have big financial considerations that you want to be going down purely an OpEx model, okay, that's one reason that you might want to go down SaaS. I do run into cases where customers don't have any internal staff that would need to go back to the application's back end, and they're really ready to wash their hands of that and hand that all over. When I see customers who don't own hardware, don't want to own hardware, I see that. What do you see, Chris, with existing customers who have current hardware? What do you find them doing most often?
So a lot of customers that I've spoken with, the cloud computing has come down in cost pretty recently. So a lot of times they kind of vetted, here's the cloud option or SaaS option when they first purchased their equipment. And so they're interested in looking at it, but they also have to think about the already sunk costs into their equipment. So there is a window that really fits into that model that you should always benchmark kind of that private cloud or SaaS option every time you're looking at doing a server refresh. That's when it makes sense to kind of look at that footprint and see, is this going to be a great fit for us? As far as ROIs, OpEx versus CapEx. So those are some considerations. Another consideration is a number of locations. If you are running an ERP and it's hosted out of like a corporate headquarters, if you have multiple locations and you don't have a robust disaster recovery solution in place, which can get really expensive on-prem, it is a much cheaper option to deploy that via cloud and have a disaster recovery solution attached to it versus doing it on-prem. So that's another huge kind of thing that our customers weigh into of what solution is going to be the best fit for them.
Yeah, I've seen that with customers with existing hardware. So the hardware hasn't timed out yet, but they want to get it out of the closet. So they end up going with kind of an interim colo step. They move their servers to a co-location, a data center that's hopefully a little better central, and they can add disaster recovery on top of that, and kind of wait out the life cycle of that server before they move to a cloud option. Kind of a nice baby step to cloud, I guess, might be a way of thinking about it.
Yeah, I've seen customers do that pretty frequently if they're in that like roughly probably 2 to 3 years on equipment and they want to look at a cloud option. A lot of them will take a look at co-location and look at relocating the on-site equipment.
Right. So a couple other things I've seen for SaaS would be If you're a customer with minimal integration needs, SaaS is quite often a much easier lift. And yes, I
Mhm.
see a certain percentage of customers who don't have huge integration needs. E-commerce is probably one that's very frequent, but many customers just have an e-commerce need for integration. And I would say most of the e-commerce partners that we're working with now are communicating over the IP layer or the API layer, which allows for pretty easy SaaS configurations. If you don't have a problem with upgrades, I know some customers actually want to upgrade more, and these are probably customers that goes with the idea of an uncomplicated environment is easier to upgrade. So if you have that luxury, you want to take it, you want to take that opportunity.
Mhm.
I think from a complexity standpoint, we've talked about configuration versus customization. I had one customer who had bought SaaS, and this customer, I didn't even know if this customer was a good fit for ERP. They were so customization driven in terms of the software has to twist to fit our needs as an
Sure.
organization. This is kind of you going back to the 80s, the classic of I over customized the ERP system and now it doesn't work. Failure projects that you kind of but certainly in a SaaS environment, that's just a recipe for disaster because it is the knife into a gunfight kind of situation. Because in terms of customization abilities, a SaaS ERP is really a knife in a gunfight. And then we talked about existing footprint, right, and the difficulties of trying to twist. You got square peg, round hole, and you're taking this hexagonal ERP system and you're trying to shave off the corners so it'll fit into a SaaS deployment. I think really if you're a new ERP customer and you're kicking the tires for the first time, you have a much better chance of being successful. And I think
I
that's
would
where
agree with that.
we find a lot of customers that are on the bounce, right? They didn't want to be on prem anymore. They kicked the tires with SaaS. It went poorly, and now they come back to a hosting private cloud provider like us and say, okay, what can we do now? And then if you're, the last piece was that if the solution you're implementing is a spoke and not the hub, SaaS isn't something that I would chase people away from, because we have a ton of partners who have great solutions, third-party solutions that sit on a SaaS
Yep.
platform and aren't problematic. I'm really speaking to that hub. And then the one piece again I would reiterate is that idea of a native SaaS versus a retrofit. You really want to watch out for that. So if you're buying NetSuite, yeah, you know that you're getting something very specific. Some other vendors, you might be playing with a version that's kind of a red-headed stepchild of something else. Red hair is a problem I wish I had. So question there. Now that we've kicked the tires on SaaS, now we're going to go private. So when we talk about hosting and the capabilities there, access and control, I think you've mentioned it there, Chris, that if you have access to the database server and the app server, you have if you need that access. Now we have some customers, some of our best customers are those type of folks that we never hear from them because they have such a big IT staff. So we spun up the environment from then, and they just took it and ran, and they send us Christmas cards at the end of the year, but we don't have a whole lot of interaction just because they have all the access and control that they need, and we just kind of let them run with it. And I think we got this idea of hardware as a problem. If you don't have the hardware, you don't want to own the hardware, but you have something like those access requirements, perfect time to jump into a private cloud. Now, what's your take on server expiration? I see some folks have real tight replacement cycles. Some try to stretch their servers out as long as they can go. What do you normally see there, Chris, as a good guideline in terms of the replacement timeline?
I agree with you. It's all over the place.
And what would you recommend as a preferred? Like how often should you be going through that decision cycle, do you find is best
So,
practice?
so you should definitely refresh servers if they're out of warranty. 100%, you should not be running on servers that do not have a manufacturer warranty on them. So usually you'll get a 3-year manufacturer warranty, and I see a lot of businesses extend that out to 5 years, which is pretty common for manufacturers to do on servers. I see everything from people with 8-year-old servers, 9-year-old servers that are still trying to make do, and if it's not broke, don't fix it. So I think the mileage varies, but I would say realistically, you should probably be swapping them out somewhere in between 3 and 5 years in the warranty cycle.
Right. Okay,
Mhm.
that makes good sense. Let's see. When we talk about other private cloud reasons, one would be, we talk about IT staff. You could have a varying degree of IT staff and expertise with the application to be able to jump into a private cloud, because the variances between platform as a service and infrastructure as a service. Now, you see this all the time, Chris, where we're kind of wheeling and dealing and slicing up the services and customizing that solution. What do you see most often that varies from one customer to another in terms of what they want to worry about and what they want us to worry about?
Yeah, so the thing that I see a lot that is probably one of the bigger reasons to go private cloud versus SaaS is the environment can be stretched outside of just the ERP application. So a lot of times I'm having that implementation conversation where they want to move their ERP off, from on-site to the cloud, and then a lot of auxiliary services follow. So if they have file servers, Active Directory. So if they want to move that footprint and eventually get everything offsite, private cloud's a much better solution, because in the SaaS model, you can only really put the application up there. You can't tie in other layers into that cloud model in the SaaS version. In a private cloud, you can, and that's a huge selling point that I see a lot of businesses. They start with their ERP, and then it kind of just moves from there, where they end up trying to put as much as they can in the cloud, so they don't have to buy any more hardware.
Right. So it scales into the rest of the business. Gotcha.
Yes.
Good. Other ones that we talk about would be the integration needs, and we've covered that several places here. That you might have integration needs that aren't supported in a SaaS environment that would be in a private cloud. Big piece we've talked about here is the control of upgrades and updates. If you want to stay on a 2-year cycle, this is available there. If you have a more complexity in your business requirements and you need a great deal of customization over configuration, a private cloud is a better chance there. And then if you're an existing ERP customer and you want to do something quick in terms of you want to shift that environment into cloud, and we've had some customers who've had to do that shift because they were an existing customer and they've had like disasters on their side. What have you seen there, Chris, in terms of, we've talked about lift and shift as an opportunity with cloud migrations. What have you seen customers, and what have they been after in terms of that kind of migration?
So a lot of times, a lift and shift is for speed purposes, it can be done. It's usually the less complicated. But what I see most customers do when they take this step to move to a cloud environment, especially a private cloud environment, is they do a net new. So they install the application and then they work through the integration. So they'll bring over the database and that's retained. But when they do a net new versus a lift and shift, it gives you a chance to kind of implement best practices. If your ERP was maybe configured and it wasn't configured right, or there's some things that you didn't have visibility into, it's kind of a get your data and application clean when you do a net new build. And so I see a lot of customers really want to take that approach versus doing a lift and shift where you're just kind of dragging and dropping the environment.
Yeah, so lift and shift might be only an emergency case. Like we had one customer that was, their data center had gotten hacked, so they move in a hurry. So there was no time to do this in a clever and pretty way. They needed to get something up and running immediately. So they basically picked up and dropped into our hosting environment so that they could be up and running ASAP.
Yep.
All right, so this is a nice little description here of IT responsibilities. And Chris, why don't you go through this? You've always been better at talking through kind of the tiers of how IT responsibilities shift as you get from an on-premise into a service model.
Sure. So yeah, if you start on-premise, you pretty much own everything, right? You own the security, the software, the monitoring, everything that goes into that environment. As you kind of move up that chart, you really move into infrastructure as a service. And this is where I see a ton of customers seem to gravitate towards this. So they're not necessarily responsible for the resources. We'll do some hybrid infrastructure as a service kind of solutions as well. So where we'll do some of it, but they're the primary lead on that. So we can drop our monitoring tools, our kind of patch management, but they still monitor, manage, and like use security, deploy some of their own internal tools in an infrastructure as a service kind of model. Then when you move into platform as a service, that's basically like a managed ERP where we're managing the infrastructure that stands up your application. So you just pretty much are responsible for licensing. We take care of all of the backups, everything that's tied into that to kind of remove that from your plate. The big difference between that and software as a service is the amount of access you have into the environment. That's the huge leap, is when you move from platform as a service to software as a service, is the amount of access that you and control you have over data integrations, things of that nature. So you can almost think of platform as a service is pretty much full access SaaS in easy terms to explain it.
I like that. I like that a lot. And I think the other piece to note here at the bottom there is that there's definitely a lot of overlap. That if you have different needs, that the rigor between, say, infrastructure and platform as a service, there is no brick wall between those two. And that customers that need some kind of a blended hybrid approach, there are all kinds of things that can be done to support that. All right. Well, so wrapping up here, I want to thank you all for attending. I want to leave you with one kind of harrowing quote here at the end. This was someone who came to us and they said, and they put that in capitals. Tell anyone you know who's thinking of moving to SaaS if they need to wait. And I pray and wish I did not do it. I've been using this specific ERP for 20 years, invested heavily in it. Now the product, they actually described it as deteriorating the SaaS model in terms of what on-prem can do versus the cloud. Simple stuff that's not working yet. And I think I agree here that those issues will eventually be fixed. You know, the SaaS is an evolving software solution, and eventually those challenges will be fixed, but it's going to take some time. Anyone considering SaaS should wait. So that's, I guess, my last little harrowing bit there about customers who have complex environments and want to jump straight into the cloud. I think there are some better options for you, honestly. So Chris, well, thank you for your time today, and to our attendees, thank you for yours. If you have questions, you can certainly reach out to Chris or myself, or if you want to browse our website and see some more information about different cloud models and capabilities, go ahead to estesgrp.com or send an email to our sales email at sales@estesgroup.com. And I wanted to thank you all for attending, and you have yourself a very fine weekend.